Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources, the articles, the reports, the court documents you share, and really unpack them to get to the core insights.
Exactly.
Today, we're diving deep into a case that spent over a decade twisting and turning its way through the legal system. It's quite a story.
It really is. It's a look at the disappearance and ultimately the murder of a young woman. We see the challenges in the initial investigation, these two remarkably different trials held years apart.
Right.
And the complex legal fight that eventually brought a resolution. But, maybe didn't answer every single question for everyone.
And our mission here is to be your guides through this stack of material you sent. We'll pull out the key details, the surprising facts, the moments that really define this long road to justice.
Yeah, give you a clear understanding of what happened, why it matters, without getting totally bogged down in the legal jargon.
Okay, let's unpack this. So to start, let's focus on Hannah. Who was she? From your sources, we know she was just 18 years old in May of 1999. How's she described?
Well, you see terms like everybody's sweetheart, a former homecoming queen. People called her lovely, bubbly, always happy, very friendly. Some sources even mentioned she might have been maybe too friendly with strangers sometimes, just a very open person.
It says a really nice kid who, as one source puts it, loved everybody. The Spice Girls, signed letters with pink hearts. Pretty much a typical teenager, really.
Totally. A bit of a hopeless romantic, looking for her Prince Charming, but also, taking those first big steps into adult life.
Right.
She lived at home in Akron, Ohio, had just gotten her first car, that Geoprism, giving her that first taste of real independence.
And she was excited, right, about starting a new job.
Yeah, really excited. A new secretary job at an ATM company starting the very next day. She was on her way.
Okay, so let's set the scene.
Yeah.
Wednesday, May 19th, 1999. Hannah gets home from work, has dinner. Your sources say she talks to a friend around 9 p.m. Mentioned she has no plans, getting ready for bed in her basement bedroom. Seems like a normal night.
Pretty much. Her mother heard her on the phone a bit later. But then around 10:30 p.m., something shifts. Hannah tells her mom she's going out for a little while, says she'll be right back, says, love you.
And her mother noticed something, didn't she? That Hannah seemed off.
Yeah, the sources say she seemed disturbed about something, kind of in a rush when she left. Meanwhile, her boyfriend, Brad, he's expecting her to pick him up for her new job the next morning.
But she never comes back.
Never showed. As her brother, Justin, put it, they never saw her again after she walked out that door.
So, obviously, when she doesn't come home, misses her first day at the new job, the family knows something's wrong.
Immediately. Yeah, they reported her missing that evening, May 20th. They knew this wasn't like her.
But this is where things start to go wrong with the investigation, right? According to your sources, the police response was less than urgent.
That's putting it mildly. Sources mention an initial lack of concern. The thinking was, well, she's 18. Sometimes kids her age take off for a day or two.
So the report wasn't immediately entered?
No, not immediately put into their system. And this initial delay, well, it would turn out to have pretty significant consequences.
Because days go by.
Right, days pass. Then, neighbors over on Kane Road, described as this quiet, dead-end street, they start calling the police about an abandoned car. It's Hannah's Geoprism.
And they could see stuff inside.
Yeah, they saw the keys just sitting on the dashboard, and her name was written in a couple of places inside the car, visible.
Okay, so the car's found, reported. But here's the police fumble, as some sources call it. What did the officers do?
They came out, saw the car, and they ticketed it for being abandoned.
Ticketed it.
But they completely failed to connect that car to the missing person report for Hannah Hill for a full week.
A whole week?
Yeah. It was later called a black eye for the department, a screw-up. And you can see why. That delay might have compromised the investigation horribly.
Giving whoever was responsible time.
Exactly. Time to potentially cover tracks, clean up a scene, get rid of other evidence. It was a critical window that was missed.
So it wasn't until a week after she disappeared, and only after police finally went to the media and got tips connecting the car to Hannah, that detectives actually went back to Kane Road.
Right. And this is when the case takes that really sickening turn. They opened the trunk of her Geoprism.
And they found her.
They found Hannah's body inside. One detective described the scene as something you can't unsee. Just horrific.
Your sources are pretty specific about the scene. She was naked from the waist down, shirt pulled up.
And posed, knees bent and apart, exposing her genitals. But her pager and her car keys were still there, inside the car.
And the cause of death?
The medical examiner determined it was homicide by asphyxiation. specifically manual compression of the neck, strangulation.
By hand.
By hand.
Right.
And she also had multiple injuries, blunt force trauma to her face and head. She'd been beaten.
So with the body found, police immediately start looking at the people closest to her. And the first person they focus on, based on these sources, is the boyfriend, Brad O'Born.
Yeah, Brad. Described as having more than a few rough edges. A high school dropout, involved in dealing drugs, someone who apparently liked to chase other girls.
And the family wasn't happy about him, were they?
No, not at all. Her family and friends were worried. Her dad, quote, made no bones about it, tried to keep them apart. Friends told Hannah she could do better.
His initial interaction with police didn't really help his case either, did it?
Not really. Before they found the body, when he went to the police, sources say he was demanding, even fuming, kind of abrasive. And the officers noticed scratches on him.
Scratches. And did he explain those?
He did. He admitted he and Hannah had a big fight just a few days before she disappeared about him cheating on her, and he said she scratched him during that argument.
Okay. And he was pretty open about the relationship problems.
Surprisingly open, yeah. He admitted to police he was a bad boyfriend, even abusive. Sources say he admitted verbally abusing her and initially physically abusing her too, kicking and slapping. Though later, during testimony, he denied the physical part.
And described as jealous, controlling.
So you've got this really troubling history, this abrasive demeanor. But then, after her body was found, detectives said he seemed cooperative. Distraught, even.
Didn't lawyer up.
No, didn't ask for a lawyer, urged them to find his girlfriend. He was, as one source puts it, a puzzle for the investigators.
But despite all that background, the key thing is, police didn't find direct evidence linking him to the murder itself.
That's right. Your sources state he was never regarded as a serious suspect for the murder by the authorities or even Hannah's friends and family, though, he did serve time later for unrelated drug charges and robbing a bank. But not for Hannah's murder.
Okay, so if the focus eventually shifted from Brad, where did the investigation go next?
Well, a really crucial piece was Hannah's phone logs from that last night. Investigators looked closely at who she called.
Besides Brad and the girlfriend?
Right, there was another call to a guy named Denny Ross.
Denny Ross, who was?
He was 20 at the time, actually a friend of Brad's. His apartment had this reputation as a fun house or a crash pad.
And Hannah's friends were surprised she was involved with that crowd.
Yeah, they were. Admitted they were maybe a bit naive about who she was spending time with. And Denny himself, he wasn't exactly clean. He was on probation for cocaine trafficking.
So police go to talk to Denny, and his reaction, that was immediately strange, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, very strange. When detectives showed up at his apartment, sources say he answered the door with his attorney already on the phone.
Wow. Okay. That's definitely, as the source says, a little different.
You'd think so. Red flag, right. But incredibly, despite having his lawyer literally on the line, Denny gave them what's called an astonishing bit of information.
Which was?
He admitted Hannah had slept over at his apartment the night she disappeared.
Okay. What was his story?
His version was, Hannah showed up around 11 p.m. upset about Brad. He claimed they, quote, kissed and stuff, but that she left his place sometime after midnight and he hadn't seen her since.
Which, if true, makes him the last known person to see her alive.
Exactly. So based on that admission, police got a search warrant for his apartment. And this is where we get to the magic bag.
Right. What happened during the search?
While officers were inside searching, in the early morning hours, other officers posted outside heard a noise, a thud. They looked down and found a garbage bag right beneath one of Denny's windows.
And inside the bag?
Inside were Hannah's missing clothes, her underwear, her pants, socks, shoes, and her purse. Everything she was wearing, basically.
Prosecutors would later call this the key factor, the magic bag. It seems like damning evidence.
On the surface, yes. But this is where some skepticism creeps in, particularly from that reporter, Ed Meyer, mentioned in your materials.
What were his issues with it?
Well, he questioned the timing and the logic. Why would Denny hold on to this incredibly incriminating evidence inside his apartment for a whole week?
Right.
Only to decide to toss it out the window the exact moment police are there searching. It seemed convenient, or maybe too convenient.
And there were other physical questions about the bag itself.
Yeah, Meyer pointed out Denny's fingerprints weren't found on the bag. The bag itself didn't match the brand or type of other garbage bags found inside Denny's apartment. And crucially, the officers didn't check the temperature of the bag or its contents, which might have indicated how long it had been outside.
So questions about whether it was really thrown out just then, or maybe placed there?
Exactly. It definitely raises questions. But regardless of those questions at the time, the discovery of that bag and its contents was enough.
It led to Denny Ross being charged.
Yes. In October 2000, he went on trial for Hannah's rape and murder. He was facing the death penalty. He pleaded not guilty.
Okay, so the first trial. What was the prosecution's case?
Their theory was pretty straightforward. Denny raped and killed Hannah inside his apartment. He strangled her there. The garbage bag, obviously, was their star piece of evidence, linking him directly to her disappearance.
And they tried to connect the injuries to him physically.
They did. They suggested the blunt force trauma to her face might have come from a cast Denny was wearing on his arm at the time. They pointed to trace amounts of sulfur and carbon stuff found in medical casts that were discovered in the wounds on her face.
And the defense.
Yeah.
What was their strategy?
Completely different narrative. They argued Denny was innocent, that he was being framed, and the person framing him, Brad O'Born.
Back to Brad.
Back to Brad. They painted him as the abusive, jealous boyfriend who was the real killer. They hammered on the lack of physical evidence inside Denny's apartment.
Right. If she was murdered there, where was the blood? Where was
Right.
any sign of a struggle?
Exactly. No blood, no excrement, none of the forensic traces you'd expect from such a violent crime scene. They argued it couldn't have happened there.
And they brought up Brad's history again.
Oh, yeah. They emphasized his history of fighting with Hannah, his jealousy, the abuse, those scratches he had. They called witnesses who testified they'd seen Brad be abusive in the past.
What about the semen found on her underwear that linked to Denny?
The defense acknowledged it linked to Denny, consistent with his story that they'd kissed and stuff, but they argued it was a very small stain and was hardly proof of a crime, certainly not proof of rape and murder.
So, two very different theories presented to the jury. The case goes to them for deliberation, and then something really unexpected happens.
Yeah, a stunning turn, as one source calls it. During deliberations, the judge suddenly stops everything and declares a mistrial.
A mistrial. Just like that. Why?
Well, a mistrial means the trial has to be stopped before a verdict because something went wrong that prevents a fair outcome. In this case, the judge got a note. It revealed serious juror misconduct.
What kind of misconduct? What did the juror do?
One juror had brought up information that was absolutely not part of the evidence presented in court. Specifically, this juror mentioned that Brad O'Born, the boyfriend, had supposedly taken and passed a polygraph test.
Which the jury wasn't supposed to know or consider.
Exactly. Polygraph results generally aren't admissible evidence anyway, and this juror was apparently using this outside fact to pressure other jurors, basically saying, look, Brad passed a lie detector, so Denny must be guilty. Let's wrap this up.
Wow. So that completely tainted the process.
Completely. It compromised the jury's impartiality. Legally, the judge determined it was a case of manifest necessity, a situation so fundamentally flawed that the trial couldn't fairly continue. He had to declare a mistrial.
How did the lawyers react?
Sources say the prosecution was stunned. The defense was described as brokenhearted, not because they thought he was guilty, but because they believed they were on the verge of acquittal and wanted the case dismissed with prejudice, meaning he couldn't be tried again.
And here's maybe the most incredible part of that first trial. What was discovered after the mistrial was declared?
This is amazing. It came out later that the jury had actually already reached verdicts on the major charges, and they had signed verdict forms finding Denny Ross not guilty of aggravated murder, and rape.
Not guilty. They'd already decided.
They had already decided and signed the forms. He had come, as the source says, so close to being acquitted by that first jury before the misconduct surfaced and stopped everything.
Unbelievable. But a mistrial doesn't mean acquittal. So the fight wasn't over.
Not by a long shot. Denny's lawyers immediately started fighting to prevent a second trial. Their main argument was double jeopardy.
Right. You can't be tried for the same crime twice after you've been found not guilty.
Exactly. And their argument was, look, the jury had voted not guilty on the big charges, even if the verdict wasn't formally announced. Trying him again would violate that fundamental right.
So this kicked off a long appeals process.
Years of it. The case went up through the Ohio state court system, even into federal courts, and eventually landed at the Ohio Supreme Court. Understanding the appeals process here is key. It's all based on legal arguments about potential errors in the trial, argued through written briefs and sometimes oral arguments before panels of judges. They only look at the trial record.
And after all that time, more than a decade, what did the Ohio Supreme Court decide?
They ultimately sided with the prosecution. They overturned the lower court rulings that had blocked a retrial. Their reasoning was that the first mistrial was declared because of that manifest necessity, the juror misconduct.
So it didn't legal count as an acquittal.
Correct. Because it didn't result in a formal acquittal or conviction due to the unavoidable misconduct, retrying Denny Ross would not violate double jeopardy protections. The door was open for round 2.
And there's no time limit on murder charges in Ohio.
Right. Your sources confirm there's no statute of limitations for felony murder there, so the prosecution could proceed, even after all those years. Denny had actually been out on bond for a while after spending over a year in jail during these appeals.
But that freedom wouldn't last.
No, his freedom was, short-lived.
So fast forward 13 years after Hannah's death, August 2012, Denny Ross is facing a second trial. Must have been incredibly difficult for Hannah's family.
Unimaginably hard. Sources mention her mother dreaded going through it all again, but felt she absolutely had to be there every single day.
And this time, the prosecution's case was different. Stronger.
Yes, described as considerably stronger. 2 main reasons. Huge advances in DNA technology over that decade, and they had new witnesses. The specific charges were also slightly adjusted from the first trial.
Okay, let's break that down. The DNA, that sounds like the game changer. What could they find now that they couldn't before?
It was pretty damning. With the more advanced testing, they found Denny's blood in 5 separate spots on Hannah's panties.
His blood.
His blood. And 3 spots of his blood on her pants, the clothes recovered from that garbage bag. They also found his semen on the inside of her pants and on the back of her panties.
Inside the pants, too.
And maybe most significantly, they found his DNA underneath Hannah's fingernails.
Suggesting a struggle.
Exactly. That strongly suggests a struggle, that she fought back and got his skin cells under her nails. Plus, DNA found on her shirt was also consistent with Denny's profile. This was way beyond the small semen stain discussed in the first trial. This painted a picture of a much more direct physical interaction connected to her clothing and her body.
That sounds like incredibly powerful physical evidence. What about the new witnesses?
The prosecution also brought in evidence of what they termed Denny's pattern of behavior. This wasn't about the night Hannah died, but about other incidents.
What kind of incidents?
Several witnesses testified about Denny having a history of choking women during sex. One ex-girlfriend gave specific testimony saying he choked her, left bruises on her neck, and threatened her.
Wow.
And another woman he dated briefly testified that Denny had talked about achieving the ultimate orgasm by, quote, choking a woman out during the orgasm.
That's incredibly disturbing and obviously draws a direct parallel to how Hannah died, strangulation.
It does. But perhaps the most impactful new witness was Jennifer Tittle. Her testimony was described in your sources as electrifying.
Who's Jennifer Tittle?
She met Denny years after Hannah's murder. It was in 2004 when Denny was actually out on bond from the first trial.
Okay.
She testified that Denny violently attacked her in her own home. She said he choked her from behind until she passed out multiple times. He stabbed her. He repeatedly punched her in the face, breaking her jaw and her collarbone. It was a brutal assault.
My goodness.
Yeah.
And did she say anything Denny said during the attack?
Yes. This was chilling. She testified that at one point she pretended to be dead to try and make him stop. And she heard Denny say, "Oof, she's dead. Not again.
Not again."
Not again, implying he'd done this before. And Denny was actually convicted for this attack on Jennifer, attempted murder, and rape, and sentenced to 25 years in prison before his second trial for Hannah's murder even started.
So the jury in Hannah's second trial heard all of this.
They heard Jennifer's harrowing testimony. And the prosecution argued it showed a clear, terrifying pattern, drawing parallels between the severe beating and manual strangulation Jennifer survived and how Hannah Hill had died. It spoke volumes about his potential capacity for such violence.
So you have this much stronger DNA evidence. You have this pattern evidence, including Jennifer Tittle's testimony. How did the defense respond in this second trial? They still maintained his innocence.
They did. They stuck to their guns. Denny was innocent, framed by Brad. They continued to hammer away at the problems with the initial police investigation.
Like what? Remind us.
Like the failure to check Hannah's pager records for messages, the fact they never used luminol in Denny's apartment to check for cleaned up bloodstains. Basic stuff they argued should have been done.
And how did they try to counter that new DNA evidence? That seems tough to explain away.
Their argument was still focused on the location. They kept asking, if she was killed so violently in his apartment, how could there be absolutely zero trace evidence found inside the apartment itself? They argued the new blood spots found on her clothes were tiny, microscopic, and didn't necessarily prove the fatal encounter happened there.
They also went after the credibility of some witnesses.
Yes, particularly some from Denny's old circle. They pointed out that one witness, a former stripper, had significantly changed her story after 12 years and admitted she'd lied back then and was using drugs heavily at the time, trying to sow doubt about reliability.
What about Jennifer Tittle's testimony? How did they address that?
They argued it was irrelevant. They stressed that her horrific experience happened years later, involved a different person, and didn't prove anything about what happened to Hannah specifically. They even asked her on the stand, did you know where Hannah was the night she disappeared? And of course she said no, trying to separate the two cases in the jury's mind.
And they brought Brad back.
They did. Brad testified for the prosecution, but the defense called him too. They went after him again, pushing him on his admissions of abuse, trying to trip him up. Their main theory still rested on Brad's jealousy as the motive.
How do they try to establish that motive more strongly?
They introduced entries from Hannah's own diary, where she had apparently written about Denny. They got Brad to admit on the stand that he had read her diary,
Implying he knew she was spending time with Denny, maybe romantically?
That was the implication they wanted the jury to draw. That Brad found out, got jealous, and he was the one who killed her. Denny's father, by the way, remained his staunchest supporter throughout, firmly believing Brad was the abusive, controlling man who killed Hannah out of jealousy.
So, another complex trial with conflicting evidence and theories. It goes to the jury again. What do the sources tell us about their deliberations this time?
We get some insight. Sources reveal they were initially split. Some jurors apparently found those witnesses from Denny's past, the ones with admitted drug use or changed stories, not very believable. And those concerns about the initial police work, like the pager not being checked or the lack of luminol testing, they still lingered for some jurors. They didn't just dismiss those points.
What about Brad? Did they believe him this time?
It seems they did overall. One juror specifically mentioned watching his body language and believing him. Another was quoted saying, basically, none of us felt that it was him, and crucially, none of his DNA was there.
So if they had doubts about some witnesses and the initial investigation, what ultimately swayed them?
In the end, according to your sources, it came down to the science, the DNA evidence.
The blood spots, the DNA under her fingernails.
Exactly. As one juror put it very plainly, the DNA outweighed a lot of unknowns for us. It said Denny Ross was there. That physical link was undeniable for them.
And the verdict.
Denny Ross was found guilty on all 5 counts. Murder, felony murder, tampering with evidence, gross abuse of a corpse, and felonious assault.
In the sentence.
He was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison specifically for Hannah's murder.
But there's a catch here, isn't there? Something the jury didn't know.
That's right. What the jury wasn't told during the trial or deliberations was that Denny was already serving that 25-year sentence for the attempted murder and rape of Jennifer Tittle.
So the 19 to life for Hannah
Gets tacked on after he finishes the 25 years for attacking Jennifer. He won't even be eligible for parole consideration until he's 67 years old. It's effectively a life sentence.
What about the aftermath? Did the police department change things after those early mistakes?
Yes, sources say the Akron Police Department did implement changes, especially in their communications department, to try and prevent that kind of breakdown, specifically ensuring abandoned vehicles get cross-referenced with missing person reports immediately.
And the legal fight.
Yeah.
Is it truly over?
Well, Denny's lawyers did appeal the second conviction and sentence, and his father remained defiant, vowing to keep fighting, quoted as saying, "You can bank on it, there would be a round 3. And that reporter, Ed Meyer, he still publicly expresses suspicion about how that garbage bag conveniently appeared under Denny's window. So, lingering questions for some.
What happened to Brad O'Born?
Sources indicate he got sober after the second trial. He stated publicly that he felt the verdict finally cleared his name in Hannah's murder. He accepts responsibility for being a bad boyfriend back then, but has always denied killing her.
And Hannah's family and friends, after all that time.
Your sources describe a sense of profound relief, finally being able to properly grieve. After the second verdict, they held a balloon release, a way to find some closure, finally, for the girl described as frozen forever at 18.
It's really quite a case when you lay it all out.
It truly is. It's such a powerful illustration of how long and winding the road to justice can sometimes be. You see the impact of crucial early mistakes, that dramatic mistrial, the years and years of legal appeals, and then the decisive role that advancing technology like DNA can play decades later.
It also really highlights how subjective interpretation can be, doesn't it? The same evidence The witnesses viewed so differently by the prosecution, the defense, and ultimately two different juries. Well, almost two different juries.
Exactly. And it shows the complicated nature of using pattern of behavior evidence, how testimony about other incidents, like Jennifer Tittle's horrific experience, can be used to try and shed light on intent or capability in the crime being tried. It's legally complex, but can be very persuasive.
And you just feel the immense, decades-long impact on everyone touched by this. Hannah's family, obviously enduring that uncertainty for so long, but also Denny Ross, his family, Brad O'Born. It ripples out so widely.
Absolutely. The human cost is immense on all sides.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up this deep dive. Consider this. The case ultimately turned on scientific evidence that just wasn't available during the first trial, combined with that very disturbing testimony about a pattern of behavior years later. What does that suggest about how we determine truth and assign responsibility in our legal system, especially when the initial investigation has flaws and memories inevitably fade over such a long period?